All right, so let me just sort of start with the little bit of motivation. So what I think has been happening in the last 20 years is what I would like to essentially qualify as a information and communication technologies revolution. And by revolution, what I mean here is that there are several aspects of it. Of course, that has to do with the fact that internet and social media have become present in all our lives, basically. And I would like to say also that the very important driver of that was particularly the introduction of mobile broadband internet. What is that? That's a third generation mobile telephonia technology. So 2G was good enough for texting, and 3G suddenly became this technology which allowed uploading, downloading videos and pictures and actually communicating together with videos right away. And that led to two things. One, it was a massive expansion of internet access, and that's what we see on this graph, which is on the slide. And this is true both in developed and developing countries, and really all due to mobile broadband. Fixed internet doesn't mean anything anymore, essentially. Now, what's important is not only that it enlarged access, it also was a key driver of social media development. Of course, social media appeared before mobile broadband. Facebook, for example, was invented before, but it took off because of mobile broadband, because it was very important for social media that we can communicate with our phones quickly and with videos. And nowadays, it's over 5 billion people who are on social media. And what I want to say is that beyond the fact that it increased access of many people to internet and also increased the amount of time we spend online, it also it also completely changed what we do online. Essentially, nowadays, the way people get connected to each other, get informed, and including informed about politics, comes through social media. And of course, the meta products, particularly Facebook, is the biggest champion of this. So, right. So, one thing which I want to say is that sort of what I want to do in this lecture, basically just one thing, to link that ICT technology to the several political trends which we have been observing. And this particular graph actually comes from last week's Economist, and I thought it was really, really timely. So what it shows is the dynamics of the vote shares of different types of parties in Europe. So they look at all European democracies, and we see that from Second World War onwards, up about until the more or less 2006, 7, 8, we have a very, very stable dominance of the main conservative and social democrats parties across Europe. And then they suddenly start to decline consistently. On top of that, we also see the black schedule, which is the what has been happening with the extreme right parties. So of course they were pretty popular, before and during the war, but then they were really not popular at all in Europe. And suddenly, again, at about 2010 and later, they started to pick up. Actually, interestingly so, the Communist Party, the extreme left, also started to pick up a little bit at that same period of time, but then subsided. So what I would like to ask myself, and hopefully convince you of the answer, that these two things are related. And that's all I wanted to say. There's another very important trend which has been happening, but I'm not going to talk about that, but it is related, which is exactly more or less at the same time, starting with the Arab Spring, the world has seen its enormous amount of spread of protests. So first it was indeed Arab Spring, then it happened in this country with Indignados and Kanzian movement, then it moved to Occupy Wall Street, and then it spread everywhere in such different countries as Ukraine, Venezuela, Hong Kong, Chile, France, UK, Sudan, Iran, you name it. basically. And these pictures actually are from an NPR documentary, which says that starting with 2010, there was a decade of protests globally. And indeed, it subsided a little bit with COVID, but it is something which was going on the background. So if we ask ourselves the question, are these trends related? There are many reasons to believe they should be, particularly given that nowadays people communicate and get information in a very different way. We must expect that it has changed political equilibrium. And if we think about how should we approach this, there are three ways in which social media and internet have changed completely the way we get informed. The first one is that barriers to entry have declined substantially. There was once already time in Europe when barriers to entry for political communication declined, and that led to a lot of wars. That's in introduction of printing press. But then, since then, actually, what we see now is unprecedented. Any of us in the room can become a big media if we just produce good content. And of course, that we should expect that to matter, because nowadays opposition can reach out to voters through these mediums and actually tell some stories about the incumbents, including those stories which otherwise the voters wouldn't get, about corruption, ineptness, and so on and so forth. That's one side of it. The other side of it is that the political gatekeeping, which was done by parties and established parties and media, have become completely ineffective, because people can talk directly, politicians can talk directly to voters. Second, and that's completely unprecedented, there's nothing like that in history, the media never allowed for two ways information flows. And now with social media, there is this possibility. And that leads to, something which is related to the protest trend, which I mentioned, which is that there is a huge facilitation of resolution of coordination issues. And here I would like to say that I'm not going to talk about that in this lecture, but Ruben has probably the most important contributions in that area. So I would like to advertise his work on this. And finally, there is another important new development, which is never before AI-powered algorithms chose what people consume as far as news and political news are concerned. And now it's the algorithms, the feed algorithms, which tell people what to read in politics. And that's for a very large part of the population, global population, because a lot of people consume political news through social media. Well, and why we think that may matter? Well, because actually most algorithms are trying to maximize engagement. And if we look at what social psychologists tell us what's engaging, it turns out that inflammatory content is engaging, also content which is essentially core partisan, which confirms your priors, they're also much more engaging. And that leads to so-called filter bubbles, which may increase informational polarization, and that's also could affect politics. So all of these ideas are there, and they seem to be reasonable. So the question is, can we test them? And before I go into really giving you some research results, I wanted to give you some examples of what kind of stuff I'm talking about. And here's a gentleman which actually was pretty much one of the first signs of something was changing, particularly in Europe. So this is Beppe Grillo, comedian / founder of now completely established party in Italy, Five Star Movement. So he only campaigned on Facebook, and he obviously didn't have any access to traditional media. And yet in 2013, his party, the Five Star Movement, basically blew up the long existing Italian political system, because it got the largest share of votes for any single party. And there were two coalitions which were in front of five-star movement, but the political equilibrium shifted and it never came back again, and that was only through Facebook. So the other example which I want to give you also from elections, that's when meta products can overturn elections completely. And here we look at the two presidential elections which I picked as an example. On the left, this is the also very early example. This is 2014 victory of Klaus Iohannis in Romania. So he campaigned on a legitimate anti-corruption ticket and won, even though he had no experience whatsoever with politics. He was not allowed on media, or on traditional media. He reached out to voters exclusively on Facebook. So he was the first example of so-called Facebook president. And he actually did a lot of useful things in office while doing that. And the reason why I put his picture together with the one on the right is that it gives you a lot of irony, I think, in the fact that the person on the right, this is Jair Bolsonaro, the extreme right nationalist who won presidential elections in 2018, in many ways is very similar to Klaus Iohannis. He also was not a politician. He also was not allowed on traditional media at all, and he campaigned through WhatsApp groups in order to win his elections. And the irony goes that he also campaigned on the anti-corruption ticket, which certainly is a very legitimate policy issue in Brazil, but most of his campaign was based on misinformation and false news. So there is two sides of a coin right here in this slide. And finally, just before we get to some research, I want to mention that it's not only affecting democracies, in particular, even in autocracy where there is no access of opposition to politics at all, you still may have social media matter for politics. And here's the example of this. So this is a screenshot from Alexei Navalny's documentary, which he issued in 2017 on YouTube, when YouTube was still relatively free in Russia, which actually shook the equilibrium in that autocratic rule where already opposition was not allowed anywhere close to the elections, because that documentary exposed the corruption on then Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, which led to mass protests and then basically a huge fall in his ranking and eventual complete step away from politics. And the important thing here, what I want to stress, is that despite the fact that the autocratic rule in Russia has all the resources to try to push the narratives which are pro-regime through the internet, the only way for the regime to silence Navalny was to kill him, because of how powerful the message is. So with that, I would like to maybe tell you where I'm going with this. So I would like to try to understand whether we can find systematic evidence of the link between this political and technological trends in the European elections, in the American elections, where the party system is very different. And then we'll try to step back and try to understand what possible mechanisms are of this. All right? So that's my plan. I'd like to start with something which is a pretty seasoned paper, which I did together with Sergei Guriev and Nikita Melnikov. You see that was published 4 years ago, but I think it is still relevant today, and that's why I wanted to start with that. So what we do there, we try to document political effects of the expansion of this mobile broadband internet, meaning starting with 3G and then 4G and so on, 5G. And in particular, the first thing I want to highlight is what happened with Europe when the mobile broadband internet was spreading. And the data which we have start in 2007, which is essentially very, very early time for the mobile broadband. And we would have loved to have earlier data, but we don't. But it's almost the very beginning. And we get it until the 2018. And in these maps which you see here, what we show is how much of a coverage, mobile broadband coverage there was between this additional broadband coverage. It was between these two dates. So particularly if you think of an average subnational district in Europe between 2007 and 2018, you would have the increase in the share of population which got access to mobile broadband of about 53 percentage points. So it's a pretty massive difference. And we're going to use that variation in order to see how that affected the political equilibria in Europe. And for that, we're going to look at the European democracies just as the same ones which I showed you earlier on the graph from The Economist. And over this period of time, there were 102 parliamentary elections, and we're gonna basically try to get all the information which we can at the subnational level for them, which gives us about 1,250 subnational region times year observations. And what we're gonna do is very, very simple thing. We're gonna try to understand what happened to the vote. First of all, we're going to focus on the vote for traditional mainstream parties. And of course, in different countries, there's different definition of what mainstream is. So for the first approximation, what we can do, we can say, okay, let's suppose that, and that's not a bad approximation, let's suppose that the two top parties which had the best electoral support in the election which is closest to 2007 are the main establishment parties. So if we do that, then what we want to see is what happened to their vote share at the time when mobile broadband comes to the subnational region within these countries compared to other places in these countries which are not covered by mobile broadband. And the long story short is that it has an enormous effect. So this is still sort of, you could think about that as a association. I know that there are many economists in the room. I was told that there will be sort of wide audience, so I wasn't really prepared to talk about identification here, but take my word for it, we do some due diligence on identification. So the long story short, we see that in an average district within a country within Europe, the 3G expansion over this decade led to about 4.7 percentage points decline in the vote share for the mainstream established parties. And this graph, which you see on the slide, it basically shows on the vertical axis the vote share, and on the horizontal axis how much more mobile broadband a region gets. And then we see this very, very strong relationship. This is sort of bin scatter plot. So we aggregate a lot of data into a few points, but it is very, very strong, that relationship. And as a person who does empirical work, I can tell you that there are not so often that we see relationship that tight, which tells you that there's something really real about that. Of course, the definition of what's incumbent could be different, so we can replicate the same thing just looking at the ruling parties. The ruling parties in places which get access to mobile broadband get less votes in the next elections. That's the first point I want to get home. So now the next question is, okay, but who is benefiting? These votes are going somewhere, right? So what's happening in Europe? And here we consider different types of opposition. So there are different ways to classify parties, and there are some standard ways which political scientists use. We do it in different ways, and no matter how you slice the data, what we see is that it's mostly right-to-wing populist vote share, which is increasing when mobile broadband comes to the subnational region in the country. It is still true that left-wing populist vote share also is increasing, but actually, as we saw before, that's only in the initial stages of the expansion of the 3G. And at the same time, the non-populist opposition, the Greens, are not affected whatsoever. So the question then is, why populists? What is happening? Can we understand what's going on? And here, sort of, when we wrote this paper, we just basically were trying to understand what could be happening. So one possibility is that it's just a very coincidental thing. In other words, populists may have been at the time the most popular opposition. Why? Well, there are a lot of secular trends which are important and on which populists campaign. That would be automation, globalization, migration, crises, a silent revolution, which gives a lot of rights to minorities and previously discriminated even majority, meaning women, and austerity as well. All of these issues are important in populist agenda, and it might be that the voters are just turning to the whoever is the most popular alternative. The other possibility is that the mechanism is causal, meaning that populist politicians are particularly good at weaponizing social media. Why one could think about that this way? Well, one thing is that maybe populist messages are particularly suited for social media communication. For example, they are simpler, more emotional, more angry, particularly among all the emotions, and they're anti-status quo. And that might be all useful for communication. On top of that, given that populist politicians despise traditional media as part of the corrupt elites, maybe connecting through social media is particularly suited for them. So in this paper, which we published in 2021, we stopped short on trying to understand which one of these is. But since then, there's a fantastic paper which I want to advertise, which appeared by Manacorda, Bellini, and Tessé, and I hope it's going to be soon published in Restart. It's still a working paper, but they are hopefully getting there. So what they've done, they've collected much better data on elections, I should say right away, and they first confirmed our main results. So they're looking at exactly the same setting, but then they wanted to go further and try to understand what is happening. Particularly, they put together data on the party manifestos and try to understand for all parties in Europe, what do they stand for? And then ask the following questions. Which policy agendas are supported by this mobile broadband? And what they find is that it's particularly parties which push communitarian ideology. What communitarian ideology is? This is against outsiders, against change, pro-tradition, against minorities, against EU. And it's a very much sort of right-wing agenda, but some of the left-wing populists also have that. And that is very important finding. There are two questions there. One is, does that mean it's causal or coincidental? And I would say that it's at least partly causal. Second is, why would social media be conducive to this kind of selling this kind of ideas? And there the authors say, okay, given that social media makes people self-select into the clubs with people who have very, very similar attitudes, on top of that, given that algorithms, even exacerbated through filter bubbles, people on social media kind of see the world as populated by people who are very much like them, and that makes them, because of the fact that on social media the emotional content is particularly fueled, it might be that make them hate outsiders, people who are not in their club, more. So to the extent that this is the case, there might be some causal relationship. However, and I would like to give that caveat here, what we also find is that populist incumbents, when they win elections, they actually are subject to exactly the same electoral pressures. So 3G actually hurts incumbents even when they're populist, which means that it's not only about it's not only about populists. It's really something which is going on with incumbents, and that's my kind of main topic for today. All right. So now, so that's what I want to say about European elections. Now, I would like to think about the following. So in European elections, what we know is that our European political systems allow for emergence of new parties, allow voters to turn to some other political actors, but in two-party systems, this is all absolutely impossible, right? So the question is, are two-party systems also affected by this technological trend or not? And in particular, the new parties essentially cannot emerge. Well, I guess they could potentially, but that would really mean a huge revolution. Within the same system, they can't. So, but it doesn't mean that nothing could be happening. Particularly, new candidates could emerge within the old parties. The parties themselves could change. Their rhetoric could change. And finally, and that's where I'm going to in this lecture, it could be that something is going on as far as how stable the seats of these politicians are who are in power. And that brings me to something which is definitely new even for people who are doing political economy in the room, because this is the paper which we just issued. It's a working paper. It's also with Sergei and Nikita and also Joanna, which tries to ask that question about the US. And let me give you a little bit of context there, because we're in Europe, we're more familiar with the European political system, but it is very important that it has been a very much established and very well known by pretty much everybody phenomenon that MPs, and particularly congressmen, but also senators as well in the US, they enjoy what is being called a pretty solid incumbency advantage. The fact that they are already won election once give them a huge boost for the future, essentially. And here are some quotes from the press from different periods of time. So we start in 1992, when it was way before internet, when we see that in 1990, 98.9% of incumbent legislators won election. That's what New York Times ran a story on. Then we fast forward to 2000, almost a decade, and we see exactly the same situation. So the Congressional Quarterly tells us that in 2000, it was exactly the same situation. 98% of incumbents were reelected. It seems to be a lot of incumbents. And then, what happened later? So there are two stories which I featured on the slide, one from the ABC News, the other from NPR, which actually start to discuss what is happening, why there is such an incumbency advantage. And what we see here is that incumbents have really much better access to financing, but there's also the question of name recognition, the attention at the federal level, which helps a lot in local elections. The fact that there was a successful campaign experience is also very important, apparently. There's also some people who attribute the success of incumbents, particularly in Congress, to gerrymandering. I would like to say that there's no clear evidence of that, actually. There was a lot of people who were trying to see whether this is the case, and it turned out to be harder to pin down empirically. So maybe that would be not the thing to blame for this phenomenon. And here's a little cartoon which basically illustrates this. So there's some pretty old people who say, okay, we're not worried about being outside of that pretty hall. And just to illustrate how important this phenomenon is, I would like to show you sort of that's as of 2020. In other words, well after the mobile broadband came. So that basically should be in our minds saying that, okay, is mobile broadband doing anything here? Because in 2020, we see what are the longest serving representatives in the House. And the only thing I want to say is that, the longest one had twice been there for the amount of time, which is twice the average age of the master's student in this institution, which tells you a lot as far as how much that person can represent local population in there, right? So, and if you genuinely see what's happening, there are lots of people who serve there until really retirement. So it's a last job for many people. But for many people, it's a last job not because they go to retirement, but because they even die in office, which is really not a very common thing for Europe, I would say. And so finally, I just want to ask the following question. Do we see anything, as far as well, let me put it this way. So if we think about anecdotal evidence, we already see that there are signs that there is some turnover which is happening. But at the same time, there's still not enough of it. But in particular, in the last Congress, which is now in operation, the 119th one, about a fifth of the representatives are 70-year-old and older. And, about 14 or 15 are 80 and older. So the question is then, when I say that maybe information and communication technology revolution shook the political equilibria everywhere, maybe I'm wrong. So, and here we would like to really try to look at the data to understand and I would like to suggest that actually I'm not wrong, that the equilibrium is changing even in this two-party system, which is much harder to shake. So before I get to what we are doing here, I would like to just mention that there has been enormous amount of political science and political economics research on the fact that congressional incumbents indeed enjoy this incumbency advantage. And on average, the literature showed that they only because of being incumbents, for no other reasons, they get 10 percentage point more vote share, which translates into 50 percentage points bigger chance of being reelected. That's enormous advantage. However, all the studies which we see actually end about sort of mid-2000s, so before the introduction of mobile broadband. And I think the reason why this literature subsided is that people just thought, okay, what else is new? It's always the same, it doesn't change, nothing is happening here. But given that we were really sure that there's something which needs to be changed with this new political equilibrium, we decided to revisit this data. And that's what we're doing. So we're going to focus on House of Representatives elections. And the reason for this is not because we don't believe that it's not going on in the Senate. It's just that this is a very useful source of data because, even though some of these people sit there for 48 years, they actually participate in elections every 2 years. So in every congressional district, and there are 435 of them, there are elections every 2 years. So we take this data and we're trying to understand what's happening with the incumbency advantage over the long term and including, when mobile broadband was introduced and try to understand whether if something changes that is due to mobile broadband or not. So how one could look at this incumbency advantage? Well, luckily for us, there is a pretty good literature, as I mentioned, and we're basically using exactly the same methodology as everybody else. What we're trying to see is how votes in a particular election depend on what the party got in the previous elections, essentially, and see whether there is any change in that relationship at the place where the elections flip. Okay, so I just don't want to be too technical about that because it's not the good place for it. So So we have really great data on these elections. So everything which is needed, which is very, very nice, much easier to get that than for Europe. So for Europe, we had to work to get this data. And then we put it together with the same source of data on expansion of mobile broadband. And here we see that the first time mobile broadband came to the US was 2008. Before there was none. And by 2012, pretty much every congressional district had a little bit of coverage. And by 2014, it's basically everywhere apart from deserts. So this is a very short period of time we are looking at as far as sort of identifying variation, but we will try to see what's happening in that period of time. And the first thing we do, we just summarize the data, and that's the way to see what incumbency advantage is. Let me tell you, let's look at, say, this particular graph. So this is just so I want to explain to you how to see that. So on the horizontal axis, this is the Democratic vote share in the previous elections. I'm sorry, but the Democratic vote margin in the previous elections, I misspoke. So in other words, when it's positive, that means the Democrat won previous elections. When it's negative, that means that Democrat lost. So if a Democrat lost, of course, that means that the Republican is an incumbent. And on the vertical axis, what we see here is the Democrat vote share in the next elections, in the elections subsequent to the one which we look at the horizontal axis. So what it essentially tells you is that, of course, there is a positive relationship. The more popular Democrats are in a congressional district in the previous elections, the more votes they're going to get in the next elections, of course, right? But interestingly so, we see everywhere on the top row of these graphs a jump at 0 vote margin. What does it mean? That means that just being in the office gives this vote share advantage to the incumbent in next election. So that's how people have been estimating that. Of course, there are many caveats. You need to look only at competitive elections. You need to look at the elections where there are no redistricting. But, we do all of this analysis on the background. The important thing is what we see on the top row is just what we already knew before. So the literature knew that the vote share advantage is about 10 percentage points. And then what's happening on the bottom row, it's starting with 2006 onwards, it looks like it's been shrinking. And the better way to illustrate this is if we put some controls, let's say we account for all sorts of different relationships, then these schedules become flatter because we count in also for this average tendency to vote either Republican or Democrat, and we see what's happening here. So the jump at 0 had been stable since 70s until 2006, and since then it has started to shrink. And just to restate exactly the same thing, so these are the graphs on the left of this incumbency advantage measured as this jump at the 0 vote margin. So it's been pretty stable, well, jumping around a little bit, but pretty stable. And then at the time of the arrival of mobile broadband, as you can see, it started to shrink. Interestingly so, on the right, we also look at the election probability. And the election probability was for the incumbents at about 52 percentage points more than for the challenger. And once the mobile broadband has been introduced, that also fell, although it's more noisy, the estimates, simply because the outcome is binary. There's less variation in there. All right, so far I just showed you the dynamics and nothing else. So I haven't really told you anything about where mobile broadband comes into the picture. So, and in order to do this, what we need to have the following exercise. Try to compare these jumps meaning these measures of incumbency advantage separately for places which were covered by mobile broadband and places which weren't, or restating it within the same congressional district to see how the incumbency advantage behave before and after mobile broadband comes into that district. And this is precisely what these two schedules show you. So on the left, this is how the incumbency advantage in vote share was affected by introduction of mobile broadband in an average congressional district. And we see that before the congressional district was covered by mobile broadband, there was really no pretense whatsoever. And after that, there is a pretty large decline. And that the interesting thing is that this decline is actually pretty much equal in size to the overall shrink in the incumbency advantage. And on the right schedule, we see the same analysis for the probability of being incumbency advantage and the probability of being reelected. And here we again see pretty large effect. So just to talk about magnitudes, we see that before the arrival of 3G, incumbency advantage was rather stable. And after that, the vote share of incumbency advantage decreased by about 7 percentage points from 10 to 3 on average. And all of it is due by size due to the arrival of mobile broadband. And as far as the re-election probability, it fell by about 40 percentage points from 50 more or less to 10 percentage points. It's still positive, but much smaller. And it again seems to be very much summing up to the effect of the mobile broadband. The important thing, of course, that at exactly the same time, there were other things which were going on. Particularly, there was a Great Recession. So we really, it's important to work a little bit to show that there are no confounders. So I would like to assure you that our results are absolutely unaffected. Whether we do or do not control to what extent the congressional district is affected by Great Recession, be that if we measure the unemployment, housing prices, or other ways in which local economy was hit. All right, so then the next question is sort of, are both parties affected by this? And here, in order to really understand this, we need to kind of change methodology a little bit, because generally the vote share for one is one minus the vote share for another. So here we look at the bi-party vote margin as a share of the let me put it this way: bi-party vote share as a function of bi-party vote share in the previous elections. So that's essentially the sum of these two bars is the incumbency advantage, as I was showing it to you before. So what we see essentially is that both parties have similar effect eventually if we compare the situation with their incumbency advantage before any mobile broadband and after all of the congressional districts have been covered by mobile broadband. So the last bar, the black bar, which is, you can't see because it's 0, this is the difference in incumbency advantage by party, okay? However, that's not the full story. In particular, if we look at the whole dynamics of incumbency advantage, what we see is that initially, and here, I just want to show you the timing of the introduction of mobile broadband. We see, so what we calculate here is the incumbency advantage for the congressional representatives who are from the same party of the president who is sitting in the White House and who are of the party of opposition. And it turns out that initially those who are affected are the ones from the party of the sitting president. and only after that it trickled down to the opposition party. So again, we need to ask ourselves, is that related to mobile broadband, or this is just a coincidence? And here we really need to do essentially differences and discontinuities. So we need to get another difference on top of that to be able to estimate this. And we show that at the time of the initial expansion of mobile broadband, and that was the time around 2008. So before 2008 it was George Bush. After 2008 it was Barack Obama. And we see that during George Bush, those what was happening was that if the incumbent is if congressional incumbent is Republican, they would be affected by this decline in the incumbency advantage, whereas the Democrats initially weren't. And then in 2008, that switched until everybody got their seats shaken a little bit. So that's the next thing which we are showing here. So finally, we want to ask ourselves the question, so what changed in this very rigid two-party systems? How is it the case that for many decades incumbency advantage was there and suddenly it becomes much smaller? So for that, we try to collect as many data sources as we can to try to shed light on it. And what do we see? Well, so first of all, we'll look at the surveys. It's CES surveys of American voters. There's question on voters' disapproval of the incumbent congressman. And we see, and so what I plot here is the effect of mobile broadband availability on these different outcomes. And we see that when mobile broadband arrives, the disapproval of incumbents significantly rises. So then we also ask about the knowledge of voters about both incumbents and challengers. Luckily, we have information on both. On the approval, we only have information on incumbents because you cannot approve somebody who hasn't been in office yet. But you could still have information about whether voters know something about it. And we do see that in the US, despite the very, very developed, and open system of traditional media, mobile broadband makes people more informed about their congressional representatives. And so then we also look at the very, very granular data which exists in the US on campaign contributions. And what we see is the following. We particularly look at the individual contributions, their number, their amount, and within them, the contributions to the campaigns which are of small size. And what we see across all of these outcomes, the challenges have been helped significantly by mobile broadband. Interestingly so, there is an insignificant effect, but also somewhat positive for the incumbents. So we cannot reject the statistical test that these effects are equal. So we cannot say that we definitely can say that the gap in terms of financing shrank. But we do know that challenges have been helped by mobile broadband. All right, so far I just basically have tried to convince you that both in European democracies and in the US, incumbents from political establishment are substantially hurt by the internet and social media. So the question is, what's the mechanism? And I hope I have a few minutes still to just talk about that a little bit. And here, I would like to give you a quote from a absolutely fantastic visionary book. It's a book by former CIA analyst Martin Gurri. It was published in 2014. So that means that before Brexit, before first election of Trump, the book is called The Revolt of the Public. And let me quote. So he writes, "The rise of Homo informaticus that's how he calls a person relying on social media for information, places governments on a razor's edge where any mistake, any untoward event can draw network public into the streets. This is a situation today which is relevant for authoritarian governments and liberal democracies. The crisis in the world concerns the loss of trust in government. And he continues, the greater the diffusion of social media, is the more illegitimate any political status quo will appear. So, and he says this possesses the existential challenge for legitimacy of every government. So that's an interesting and very, very strong statement. And we thought that we would be able to test it, and that's what we do. I'm back to this first paper I mentioned, but we're going to look at the other outcome here, which is the results from a survey done by Gallup World Poll repeatedly in over 100 countries across the globe, which ask the same question in all these different countries yearly. About the people's assessment of their national governments and institutions. In particular, we're going to focus on the following questions. Do you have confidence in each of the following or not? The national government, judicial system and courts, honesty of elections, and also another question, which is, do you believe that corruption is widespread in your country? And given that this exists for almost entire world, we are able to try to link it to the expansion of mobile broadband again. Importantly, in these surveys, we have a legalization at the subnational level, sometimes actually, and in Europe it's pretty precise. It's not two-level. So for some places it's pretty broad, but for Europe it's pretty precise. So if you look at overall what over a period of observation from 2007 to 2018, here's how the mobile broadband spread. So it didn't spread everywhere, but it spread substantially more. So about 70% of global population would have access to 3G coverage by 2018, and very few single digits, in the beginning of our period. And here we're going to look at the first overall government approval, which we're going to aggregate all of these questions into one. They are very positively correlated, and what we see is precisely the same story which I've been showing you, which translated into the electoral outcomes. In other words, government approval seems to fall on average about 5 percentage points when mobile broadband comes to the average subnational region in an average country in the world. Actually, if we slice the data by different geographical places, it would still be exactly the same. And if we want to know what are the effects for different components of this, we see that it's true for all of these components. So the way to see this is just the estimate of what the average level of all these outcomes was before the arrival of mobile broadband, and this is after with the confidence intervals, more or less. So we see that it's true for all outcomes. The belief of no corruption in government is way smaller than, let's say, generally confidence in government, but the shift is in the same direction. So here we also, given that we have a lot of data, we can do a lot of exercise and we see what's the dynamics of government approval before and after introduction of mobile broadband. And here we see that essentially there is nothing, and if anything, there's the confidence in government trending up. But once the region gets covered with mobile broadband, it goes down and continues that overall trend. So now the question is, I haven't still told you what it's about. Why should we see this? And the first question is, does that have to do with the negative information, be that fake or true, which people can access only through the social media and internet? Well, if that's the case, there are two obvious predictions. The first one is that the effects should be there only when the content of the internet is not censored. And that's exactly what we see. Particularly, here we split the whole sample into places which censor internet, and unfortunately, there's a growing number of such countries in the world. And the reason why it's growing is exactly on this slide, because we see that governments are not hurt by the internet if you censor the content of it. And it's only where internet is free, it's damaging for the national governments. So the second little bit more nuanced prediction is that, once you focus on those countries where internet is not censored, and it's very important to say that it's much harder to censor internet than to censor traditional press, because there's always a way for the governments to put pressure on tycoons which own media, even if it's not a state media. So we split the countries of the world into those which have relatively free press and relatively controlled press among those who have free internet. And that's what you see here. And we see that the effect for the countries where the state, where traditional media is more controlled, is higher. And that already tells us that probably there's something about the fact that traditional media are not telling the voters which voters want to see, and they can access that information only online. And then the question then is all of it fake? Because, clearly there's some of the information which people read online is inaccurate. We know, all of us, that there's a lot of misinformation floating on social media. So to really understand the answer to this question, we need to have the variation in the shocks to new corruption information, let's say. And what we have done was the following. We have a lot of different exercises, but I'll tell you about just one. So probably some of you remember that there was a leak in April 2016 called Panama Papers leak, when the world suddenly got to know that some of the politicians, even in the developed democracies, actually have offshore accounts which they don't talk about and don't disclose. So what we do, we focus on these countries which gave the revelation of some corruption, and then in Panama Papers, and then look at how this shock translates into beliefs about how non-corrupt, in this particular case, we split it all as a positive thing, how beliefs in no corruption in government are affected by that shock within the same country which had a scandal, but separately for regions which are covered by 3G and those which are not. And what we see here is that everywhere the belief that corruption in government is absent decreases after Panama Papers implicated the federal government agents in it, but the effect is much bigger in the regions which are covered by mobile broadband. So that tells us that there is some important information which is delivered to voters using social media and internet, which actually is real, and which traditional media, even in liberal democracies, fails to communicate, or at least, it's we don't know. Of course, when there's this failure to communicate, some of it is demand side, some of it is supply side, and we cannot separate the two. But it seems that some of it is actually, in many countries, is a supply side issue. So I know that it's Friday night and I need to wrap up. So, there are many things to talk about here, but let me just come to the takeaway slide nonetheless and tell you the following, what I think should be the takeaway of this research. Well, first of all, it is clear to me, and I hope that I managed to convince you, that internet and social media do matter for politics and explain some of the recent trends. And it is the case, and I think it's evident to me, and I don't know whether I convinced you, that the rise of mobile broadband did lead to the fall of incumbency advantage in liberal democracies, be that on this side of the Atlantic or on the other side of the Atlantic. And essentially Martin Guri was right. There is a crisis of legitimacy of every government. There's part of that research which is about autocracies, but I didn't have time to talk about that. So now the question which I want to leave with here in this lecture is that, okay, is that good or bad? And here, unfortunately, I am being a true academic. I have to say it's on the one hand, on the other hand. I cannot give you one answer to that, because on the one hand, it's clearly the case that political competition and turnout, they do increase accountability. We have a lot of evidence of that generally. And we do believe that, well, I do believe that if the politician sits, and represents congressional district for 48 years, there's something wrong with the political equilibrium. So that the fact that it's changing, it's a good thing. On the other hand, even for this particular example, so that makes potentially the congressional representatives more vulnerable, and that means that possibly they're more dependent on the national government also. So there are some serious issues which are involved even in that. And also, on the other hand, we do see that it gives rise to the populist politicians, and we know that many populist politicians have autocratic tendencies, and to the extent that they can capture the democratic institutions, means that would mean that there is really big danger here. So I would like to leave it at that. And sort of finally, I just want to advertise that I have quite a lot of research on misinformation and on the effects of algorithms, which I didn't have time to talk about. So it's just part of the story. But I'm happy to, if there are some time for a few questions, I would be happy to take them. Thank you.
So I just want to know your thoughts about. So I imagine that challengers were very quick on using this technology, and so to which extent this can be mitigated by incumbents like realizing, okay, this is really a threat for us, and then we can adjust, and then now they are maybe more faster on their feet on this. And did you look at 4G, for instance? Is the effect of 4G similar or smaller?
Well, these are two different questions. So as far as where the incumbents adapt, they try, certainly. They certainly try, but they don't succeed fully. That's what we see. So the effect which we observe is an equilibrium effect of this battle. And in fact, when we see our data on fundraising, we cannot reject the possibility that there is some increase in fundraising for incumbents as well. That's what I showed you in the graph. So here it's important to say that the real revolution was between 2G and 3G. After that, this was a gradual improvement, and it's certainly not intangible. It is this improvement, and there's improvement from 3G to 4G, from 4G to 5G. We don't know what will happen next, and I'm surprised that nobody asked me about AI, even a word. But so that would be the next revolution. But the improvements are really marginal. So everything which you could do with 4G and 5G, you could do with 3G if you are just a tiny bit more patient. So this difference in cost is huge. It's important. That brings me to another point, which is actually there were people who were able to organize even with 2G. So if you're really motivated, then even 2G technology allows you to empower you to organize protests. There is a very nice paper by Monacord and Tessay which shows that during the economic crises, people used 2G technology to organize protests even then. So, but this is a very different story from the one which I tried to tell, because now what I'm saying is that trickled down to the majority of population. Majority population is not who are usually participating in protests. This is just about average person or median person sentiment. And median person seem to be affected by this technology by making it less happy with their own governments. There's another point I want to make here is that we also want to understand whether it's just genuine unhappiness or this is really political story. And with Gallup World Poll, we can test this and we show that it's really about politics. It's not like, the fact that on social media we only encounter bad news and therefore we are just unhappy about everything, including governments. No, it's really the information about incumbents which is being delivered, and we see that it particularly attitudes towards incumbents which is changing.
Yes, I wanted to ask you two questions. One about artificial intelligence and and the fact that artificial intelligence is killing all this linking to many web pages and this marketing and the business model of many of these companies is going to disappear. But with that, probably the influence on some of this media, fake media that we've been so used in the past. Could this be a new experiment to try to grasp some of the effects that you could not see in the past? Because probably what is going to happen is that the quality of the linkage is going to be much better. Some of the misinformation is probably going to be drive out of the system by this particular procedure. It could be driven out of the system. The other question is the good or the bad, which is before you came to this, I was asking myself the same question over and over again. Is this good or bad? Is this good or bad? Can we have any way of knowing or thinking about how to solve which one, what is the welfare impact of this thing? Because in the example that you talk about, the Panama Papers were brought out by a consortium of traditional information companies, not internet-based companies. So, in fact, the only thing that they did with the internet companies was to spread out the news that were coming out of the regular.
So, both excellent questions. I do not know the answer about AI. I think, talking about ICT revolutions, I am absolutely sure that we are living through another revolution and there will be, including political effects of that. Whether we would expect less misinformation or not, I think it's an open question. We already have quite a lot of research which shows that AI being trained on internet data out there are very often biased in terms of politics as well. What it will do to the communication, I don't know. There's a lot of research which is needed and we hope to contribute to it, but for now it's just a speculation and I just have to admit that I don't know, but there should be more. So as far as the welfare effect of that's first of all, it's a really fantastic example which you gave about the traditional media. It's important to note that there's a very nice paper by Julia Cagé which shows that actually internet undermines incentives of traditional media to generate investigative journalism. They actually do their job precisely because, after that it gets copied without intellectual property rights and stuff like this. So there are dangers there. On top of that, when we talk about sort of welfare effects, we should not forget that apart from politics, there is a lot of other things which we need to talk about. So there is all sorts of different domains. For economics, for economy, it seems to be undoubtedly a good thing. So there are lots of people who get access to markets, who get, very useful information, all of these things. We have a lot of research on that. So that's a good part of it. On the other hand, there are many effects which have to do with mental health, particularly mental health of young people. And these are very, very important for for the question of welfare analysis. On top of that, there is sort of digital addiction, which not only affects youngsters but also adults. And I actually have sort of an ongoing project. It's we're about to issue a working paper where we show how the Twitter penetration in the US affected mental health using all data on private insurance claims in the US over 20 years. And I have to tell you that there is a very important turning point. Before the introduction of the feed algorithm, it actually was, if anything, more or less positive. There was really very little effect. But after the introduction of the algorithm, which is related to, feeding a lot more sort of angry, emotional, toxic content, we see that there is a lot of significant and economically significant, not only statistically significant effect on increase in mental health problems, but not only in terms of sort of self-reported and just going to the doctor, but also hospitalization. So like real stuff, not just self-assessment. So all of these things, it's really multifaceted phenomenon. And I definitely cannot tell you what the overall welfare effect of that is, because, there's always on the one hand, on the other hand, and I don't think we have a good sort of general equilibrium model which would tell you the answer. Sorry.
Let me ask, I think it's related to the last question. To what an extent I can take home the message that if there is an incumbent with a well-gained reputation of corruption, this incumbent will see decrease their advantage with 3G or internet. So is there a virtuous relation, at least in the stream, between the real content being corrupt and decreasing advantage?
I think it's a very accurate way to put it. So even though we seem to usually associate social media with the negative political effects, so there's some positive spin I want to leave us with, which is that in places where real grievance is corruption, I believe that social media actually helps to the extent that it still is held free. And that brings me back to the fact that unfortunately, increasingly in many of the autocratic regimes, the political power understands this, and therefore they just censor the internet. So to the extent that we have independent voices which can still reach out to voters, that certainly is a good thing. And this is also true in democracies, and many democracies are pretty corrupt. So I have just 30 seconds to finish it up. So there's another part of exercise in that paper which I mentioned, which I haven't told you about, and I think it's very relevant to what you are asking, which is that we looked at whether this effect is present everywhere or potentially in some countries it's not. And in particular, we ranked countries by the overall level of corruption and looked at the cleanest countries of the world. Like think about Denmark, for example. And it turns out that, spread of mobile broadband in Denmark actually increases the support for national governments. And then you kind of start with Denmark, which is the cleanest country on the planet, then increase the sample, it gets less and less positive. And once you include US, and that's only like 10 countries or so, it becomes strongly negative. Since then, no matter how corrupt the place is, it's going to be very, very strongly negative. But that actually also tells us about the mechanism which is happening there. So it is true, and Martin Guri was right, that people are outraged about sort of pretty much any mistakes of their leaders, and they become very, very visible. So life has become very transparent. But at the same time, I want to give you one example to leave off with this. So there were two scandals in European democracies recently, or relatively recently. One in Finland, when the Finnish prime minister just, went to a party, and that infuriated a lot of people on the internet simply because she was acting as a human being. But that was it. But it was really big scandal. So if you remember that, there was another party, which was the party which was organized by UK Prime Minister during COVID, when even the Queen was not allowed to, have a proper burial for her husband. So what I want to say here is that it is clear from these two examples why in the cleanest countries the effect is positive. Generally, because, even though people may be not liking their prime minister to go to party, but they can figure out that, she's not, she's way better than Boris Johnson. Because you still have this comparative effect here, because, she was just partying at the normal times and not when Boris Johnson did that, when people could not bury their dead. There's always this kind of relative comparison, and therefore, just to make the long story short, I think you're absolutely right.